So here we're going to talk about the cost of inflation. We're going to talk about the cost of inflation, which doesn't really matter which inflation level you're at. If it's bigger, the cost is going to be bigger potentially or more frequent. But we're not talking about the cost related to letting inflation vary a lot, which will come in chapter 16. So for now, let's just talk about the basic costs of inflation. So the two most important basic costs of inflation, we've kind of alluded to the third one, is menu costs and shoe leather costs. So menu costs and shoe leather costs, if you think about it, it's pretty straightforward when you just think about the name. Menu costs, well, you have this beautiful menu with all of your things that you want to sell, and you have certain prices associated to it. If there's inflation, well, you'll have to update your menu. Even though what you want to sell doesn't change, you'll have to update your prices. So the menu cost is all the costs involved in changing those prices. All the menus you have to reprint. So some places I've been to, it's pretty funny. They actually have this section with the price, and it's they just kind of Sharpie it in, but not a permanent Sharpie, one that they could erase and change it again if they wanted to. So that could be the situation to minimize reprinting these menus or making it easy. Or you'll see like one of my chiros I go and visit on his actual price list. He just kind of had a price, let's say 60, scratches it out and then puts like an 80 on top or uses liquid paper or something else. That's one way to do it. But typically people actually have to go over it. You could also think about big companies such as Renault Depot or anywhere else that have a lot of material. Well, they have to update every single price in their computer system. Like everything has to get updated so that when it gets scanned, the prices change. So they probably find ways of doing it quicker, maybe just multiplying all of them by 2% or whatever else. But they definitely have to make all those switches. So technology is helping out, but there's definitely costs involved with changing prices. Another big thing here is shoe leather cost. So the idea of shoe leather cost, I'm really bad at drawing a shoe, but it was in the old days, supposedly, that this bottom section was made out of leather. If you'd walk around a lot, you'd wear the leather. Just think about it that you're wearing your shoes as you're walking around. And the reason why you're walking around when there's a lot of inflation is you want to keep the least amount of money as cash or cash equivalents. So like in your checking account, because if there's a lot of inflation, that money is losing purchasing power every day. So you want to keep your money in things that don't lose value, such as stocks potentially or different forms of assets. So every week when you want to do the groceries or things like that, potentially you have to always run back and forth to be able to get a bit of money out to make your expenditures, to pay for whatever you're buying. So all of that leads to a certain cost. You could see it as time cost, transaction cost, or your gas or other things like that. So those are your two main forms of cost of inflation. The other one that we've kind of talked about is this inflation tax, which is essentially when you're printing a lot of money, you're dropping the value of each dollar, you're dropping the living standard. As the overall price level goes up, the price of goods and services goes up, wage of workers goes up. So potentially with inflation, it doesn't really lead to that much danger in terms of purchasing power. But it does hurt the people that hold a lot of cash or have a lot of savings. So inflation is like a tax imposed on money holders' savings. So if you think of someone that's retired and has fixed retired benefits or has a certain amount of money aside and it's generating a certain amount of interest every year and so on, that person, if there's a big inflation section that happens, can end up with a lot less money all of a sudden and a lot less savings. So it can lead to certain issues. Hopefully that person has money aside in sheltered accounts such as stocks that can potentially go up with inflation. I hope you understand why stocks is sheltered from inflation, and I'll try to explain it really rapidly here. Stocks is just you own part of a company. And if you think that there's inflation, general increase in the price level of everything, well, everything goes up in price. Like your computer that you bought is now more expensive if you buy the same one next year, or except a few changes because everything evolves. The shirts you buy, anything else that you buy just goes up in price. So if you own part of a company, well, that company, all its assets goes up in value. So your share of that company, your stock of that company, will go up in value as well. Just a quick thing to think about, like if you get like a 3% raise, you're like super stoked, or even more than 3%, but if at the same time inflation rises by more than that, well, that means that your real wages goes down in this case. And like I said, when I use the word real, I'm just removing the inflation component. So the real purchasing power that you get for every year worked or every hour worked goes down in this case. Yeah. One thing I won't spend too much time on here, but I found super interesting in the textbook, is this relationship between inflation and taxes, and how inflation may be really hard on your investments. So it's just something good to think about. Let's say we had zero inflation and you have a 25% tax on interest income. You might have more, but a 25% tax on interest income. So in the absence of inflation, your nominal interest rate would also be your real interest rate, because there's no inflation. And there's that 1-to-1. Nominal is, real is nominal minus inflation. So in this case here, real and nominal is 4. And since you lose a quarter of that to the government, you end up with 3%. Well, in the presence of 8% inflation, these real interest rates would actually be, well, your nominal would be equal to this real, which is 4% in this case, plus the inflation, which is the 8% in this case. So you'd be in a situation that you'd be getting 12% interest, and inflation is 8%. So you think, oh, this is great. But the problem is, with a lot of inflation, is this 12%, you're going to pay taxes on this whole gain, because when you go to claim your taxes and say how much you've earned, you don't really talk about inflation. There's never that inflation component in income tax reporting. So out of this 12%, you're going to lose a quarter, so you're going to remain with 9%. And from that 9%, you're going to lose 8% in purchasing power to inflation. So that's why you end up with 1%. So you can see that with the same tax rate, you could end up with a lot less after-tax income for the same real interest rate and the same tax rate if inflation is higher. Just something to keep in mind. Is deflation bad? Because when we'll talk about inflation targeting, we'll talk about the actual target. So is deflation bad? Should we go to negative inflation? Well, you have the same kind of cost as inflation, menu cost, changing the menu. But the problem with deflation is it creates a decline in economic activity. And the whole idea here is, if you think of this last recession, one of the things that happened that I noticed is you would see these stores that would not be doing so well. So they'd be like 40% off everything. And you're like, well, that's a good deal. And then the week after, 50% off everything. And then you think, well, that's good, but it could also probably get better. So people start delaying their purchases because they're like, oh, it's probably going to go to 60%, or it's probably going to get to 70%. So if you have a lot of people that start delaying their purchases, they're not buying the goods yet. If they're not buying the goods, those companies are no longer buying the goods from their producer. The producer is no longer producing the goods, so therefore those people are no longer have a job, which leads to no jobs here, no jobs there. So it creates a massive decline in economic activity, that act of delaying your purchase. Whereas when there's inflation, if there's high inflation levels, or if you think that different things that you're looking at buying will go up in price, it kind of gives you an incentive to speed up your purchases. So if you think, well, I'm going to build a house, and I was looking at the houses a while back, Visahua houses, and those ones, they could kind of sell you a package. Well, you're there in the fall, and they're like, well, this is our price now, but you should probably kind of sign in now. because in January the new prices are going to roll in, and you're like, well, this is a pretty expensive house. If they're going to add me a 2-3%, it makes sense for me to sign on now. So it's just something to keep in mind. It promotes buying quicker, whereas deflation promotes delaying your purchases, which is not necessarily good for the economy. But normally deflation is the result of diminished economic activity. It's not necessarily the cause, but it doesn't help. So essentially this is what I wanted to get to, and we'll talk about inflation targeting in the next video.